Hey everyone, I'm Robert Wasman with JRev Media, and this is the first episode of Cannacation. This is a show that's going to focus on the normalization of cannabis through education. You can expect me to discuss things like politics, research, and even the future of cannabis as a whole. And this episode is called Everything You Know About Pot is a Lie. We're going to be having, hopefully, we'll have a guest on later, Morgan Fox, the Senior Communications Manager of the Marijuana Policy Project, to discuss some of the struggles of enacting intelligent policies in the United States. We know that because of the drug war and propaganda, that we have a lot of myths and misconceptions that we have to fight through. I have Morgan Fox from the Marijuana Policy Project calling in. Morgan, are you there?
I am. How are you?
Oh, I'm living the dream. How about you?
About the same.
For the listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself and the Marijuana Policy Project.
Well, my name is Morgan Fox. I'm the Communications Director for the Marijuana Policy Project. And we are the nation's largest marijuana policy reform organization focused primarily on local, federal, and state lobbying, as well as ballot initiatives, with the ultimate goal of regulating marijuana similarly to alcohol.
The type of myths that that are prevalent in American culture about cannabis as a whole, and what kind of struggles do you have, like trying to push through those to be able to enact those types of policies on the state and federal levels?
Well, luckily, we're starting to see a lot of the stigma disappear in popular culture. Unfortunately, a lot of lawmakers, particularly those from older generations, still have this idea that marijuana is way more harmful than it actually is, particularly when compared to alcohol, and that a whole number of terrible things are going to happen if we start regulating this substance. And not only are we seeing from most of the states that have legalized it already that that's just simply not true, more and more scientific evidence is coming out every day showing that these preconceptions are wrong.
Well, one really prevalent myth, is that it's a gateway drug. How does that myth in particular, affect you trying to get that kind of regulation in on the federal level, especially since it's still considered a Schedule One?
We hear this constantly, and luckily less and less these days because the gateway theory has been disproven for more than 10 years. Unfortunately, a lot of people, they still don't think about the research. So we have to show them that there is nothing intrinsic about marijuana that makes people want to use other drugs.
What is the Marijuana Policy Project trying to do as far as the regulations? You say you wanted to get it down to how alcohol is, where it's normalized, where you can walk into the store and buy it. You can be grocery shopping and have your kids in the cart and still be able to put it in your cart. Is that the kind of normalization that you envision?
Well, we think that it'll probably end up being a little bit more restrictive than that, but the basics are that regulated and licensed businesses can produce and sell marijuana to adults age 21 and over. We also are very much in favor of having limited public consumption in terms of like bars or specific cannabis consumption locations.
So, what is one of the biggest myths that you have to push through to help get the common American to listen to the type of regulations in which you're trying to get enacted?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues that we have was with teen use. A lot of people are worried about us sending the wrong message to teenagers about marijuana use by saying that it's safer than alcohol. But in reality, honest and comparative education about all the different types of drugs will be much more helpful for teens and helping them make responsible, informed decisions about their drug consumption.
So let me ask you this, because in the political climate today, there's a lot of tension in race and in polarization of politics. And when you look at the drug war as a whole and you actually follow it back in history, you find that it actually has a lot of systemic racism built into it, especially if you talk about the Nixon drug war era, where he intentionally, tried to link it to Mexicans or the leftists and the liberals, and we see this. So, I mean, in your own personal opinion, not necessarily that of the Marijuana Policy Project, but in your own personal opinion, do you see that this reclassification and restructuring of the regulation of this is a way to remove that systemic racism that has been prevalent in the drug war?
Well, it certainly won't remove the systemic racism, but it will take away some of the tools that have been used to enforce that racism. For example, in D.C., we saw that when marijuana was legalized here, public consumption arrests for marijuana continue to be predominantly young African American men, and that's largely because there's much greater policing in those areas and a lot more just general harassment of younger kids. Also, the fact that in public housing, you risk eviction for using federally illegal marijuana, and a lot of kids don't want to, get their relatives kicked out of their housing, so they're forced to go outside. And in DC, there's no public consumption rules or social use rules, so you have to use it in a residence. The same with decriminalization. While the penalties might be lesser and the number of actual arrests are decreasing, which is a net benefit for people of color across the board, you still see those disparities existing because of the way that policing is done in this country. So it is helpful, but it doesn't eliminate the systemic racism in the system until you pretty much eliminate all penalties that could be used to target people of color.
So where can people get a hold of you, see what's in store for the Marijuana Policy Project, and where can they find out what you guys are doing?
Well, you can go to mpp.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And right now, one of our primary focuses is on making sure that medical marijuana protections continue to exist in the federal budget. So right now, and for the past couple of years, because of amendments introduced by Congressman Dana Rohrabacher and Sam Farr and Earl Blumenauer, the federal government had no methods to spend funds to go after state legal medical marijuana patients and providers. On September 30th, unless those are included in the new budget that Congress approves, those protections go out the window, which means that the Department of Justice will once again have the ability to target medical marijuana in states where it's legal. So this is a potential disaster. Yeah. And I think that we can hope for the Department of Justice to continue the hands-off policy that they did under the last half of the Obama administration. I think that in terms of protecting the existing medical marijuana industry and protecting patients and making sure that they continue to have access, we really need to make sure that these budget amendments that defund the Department of Justice when it comes to medical marijuana are included in the new budget. So all of your listeners, please contact your federal lawmakers and ask them to support protecting state medical marijuana programs.
Awesome. And one more time, you're with the Marijuana Policy Project, and they can find you and everything you're doing at?
MPP.org.
At MPP.org. Thank you so much for joining us, man. I look forward to talking to you again about this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yep. You have a great day. That was Morgan Fox of the Marijuana Policy Project. The myths are prevalent. They have stuck, and they're almost like old boogeyman stories that have caused issues, So I want to go over some of those myths, that have been undeniably proven false. One of which we actually touched on is marijuana kills brain cells. After many decades of back and forth research on this, the University of Louisville has actually determined that marijuana does not kill those precious thought makers that are inside your skull. This corroborates the 2003 report from the International Neuropsychology Society at Cambridge University that made the same claim. So the fact that marijuana kills brain cells, it's undeniably false. At this point, there's some research out there that now states that it may even help rebuild connections, especially those with cerebral palsy and even Parkinson's disease. Another myth that we hear often is, smoking pot is worse for your lungs than cigarettes. And despite having some similar components to that, a large-scale national study showed that the smoke from marijuana was less harmful than the chemical concoctions you find in your average cigarette. Now, not only that, but the consumption rate of the two drugs is strikingly different. While the average person smokes a pack a day or 20 cigarettes a day, the average daily pot smoker smokes about 5 joints a day. To reach the equivalent of smoking a pack a day, he would have to smoke 20 joints a day, which, that's definitely Snoop Dogg territory level getting high. But, let's be honest, the average user doesn't do that. Another big one that we have to deal with quite often is that marijuana is a gateway drug. You heard Morgan and I just actually discussing this. The myth is so basic and so well trodden. I considered not even putting it on this list, but alas, there is no evidence that marijuana is a gateway drug. A report by the Institute of Medicine states that no conclusive evidence that the drug effects of marijuana are causally linked to subsequent abuse of illicit drugs. Realistically, weed is just a more common drug. And therefore, those who tend to do it is a more common drug, so people are exposed to it before anything else. Legalized weed is a bad thing for the country. Now, we've definitely heard this over recent times, especially since the inauguration of Trump, and we had people like Sessions who come out and say that good people don't smoke pot, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've heard come out of a politician's mouth, and I used to work in politics. Legalized weed is bad for the country. I have one response to that. $1 billion. That's how much money Colorado dispensaries made last year, creating over $150 million in tax revenue that will go towards schools, public programs, even the elderly, along with nearly 16,000 new jobs in that area created so far. You'll also hear, right after that you hear it's bad from the country, you'll hear something like, well, the jury's still out if cannabis has any medical capabilities or uses at all. Well, in a national survey conducted in 2014, a large majority of doctors in the U.S. agreed that marijuana should either be fully legalized or at least allowed for medical reasons. Aside from it being a non-opioid pain reliever, scientists have found components in cannabis that may inhibit cancer growth. With more than half the country legalizing medical marijuana in one form or another, it appears that legislators agree. Helping people get better shouldn't be illegal. It's that simple. We have to pass all these myths. I mean, the myths that the silly ones from George Washington to the bad ones that it's a gateway drug and that it leads to violent crimes, to the point that they're saying that that there's no hardcore scientific evidence that that it has any medical uses. All of this has to be broken down. It has to be pulled apart. If not, people like Morgan Fox will never be able to enact those intelligent policies that we're trying to see in this country. I mean, if you're like me, you probably just want to see them not make any laws and just let us sell it on the corner like we do our tomatoes. But that's not going to happen. So we need intelligent policies put in place that at least are logical and follow common sense. Well, guys, that's basically the show. We are now in the section that I like to call cached. So did we learn something today? The theme of the show was to help you understand that we actually don't understand cannabis all that well. Not yet. Between the 80 plus years of misinformation and propaganda and the lack of research in today's age of information, it's sad to see that with all the real issues that cannabis has the potential to solve, that it gets pushed aside. Its potential ranges widely from the physical, like cancer or other diseases, to the psychological, like addiction and PTSD. We can even use the legalization to combat systemic racism ingrained into the drug war. Cannabis heals. It's what it does. It can even lead to us healing the ancient wounds in the mind of humanity. But like all medicine, it must be objectively understood. And that's what you can come to expect from Cannacation. We will always be honest. We will always research the truth. You can join me on Mondays and Wednesdays at noon Pacific time. And also check me out on JRev Media on YouTube, Facebook. And you can help us achieve normalization through education. Thank you guys for joining me, and continue growing.